They sold the giant girl for being too tall and too blind, but a rancher looked past all that, and he said, "You are gods." She was a 7-foot shadow in a world made for smaller people. Her eyes were dark pools in a land that worshipped the sun, and her own father put a price on her head like she was nothing more than a lame horse. Every good person in that town should have walked away. They should have turned their backs on the whole sorry affair. But sometimes, the greatest miracles come in the most broken packages, so towering, so impossible, that only one heart in 1,000 is quiet enough to hear God whispering their name. The auction yard was a foul mix of sweat, cheap whiskey, and kicked-up dust. Horses slammed their hooves against splintered stalls, men hollered numbers they couldn't afford, and the clink of coins sounded like bones rattling in a devil's cup. But the ugliest sound, the one that cut through the noise, was the laughter, and it wasn't aimed at an animal. It was for her, a girl, barely 19, a dirty blindfold tied tight across her eyes. Her feet were bare, caked in mud, and a coarse rope was knotted around one wrist, as if she were some wild thing that needed to be broken. Her father, a half-empty bottle dangling from his fist, yanked her into the center of the corral. He walked with a swagger that wasn't born from pride, but from the bottom of that bottle. "Too tall for any man to wed," he roared, his words slurring together. "Too blind to cook or clean without smashing the whole damn place." He gave the rope another cruel tug. "But she don't talk back, don't make a sound. Good, cheap labor, if you got the coin." A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd of men. It was a sharp, jagged sound, the kind that slices a person deeper than any blade. Someone spat a wad of tobacco into the dirt. Another man leaned against the fence, a greasy smile spreading across his face. "Ain't no man gonna buy a mountain that can't see where she's steppin'," he called out. Through it all, she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. Her face was a still mask, her chin lifted just enough to defy them. She couldn't see their faces, twisted with mockery, but you could tell she felt their cruelty pressing in on her from all sides, a physical weight. And that's when Silas Kurion saw her. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, his hand resting on his belt buckle, his jaw locked so tight a tooth might crack. He was a man carved from silence and hardship, his face a road map of lonely days and long nights. He'd come to town for a new draft horse, nothing more. His ranch was quiet, his heart was heavy, and he wasn't looking for trouble. He had come for work, not for this spectacle. But then, her blindfolded face turned, as if on a string, directly toward him, and everything inside Silas went still. It wasn't a plea she sent across the dusty yard. It was something else. A strange, silent knowing. It was like she could see him right through the blindfold, right through his skin and into his soul. Like she already knew the shape of his loneliness, because she'd been carrying a piece of it her whole life. Her father yanked the rope again, nearly pulling her off her feet. "Who's buyin'? I ain't dragging her back to my land, worthless as dust on my boots." A hush fell, then more snickering. Men shuffled their feet and looked away, not one of them willing to part with a single coin for what they saw as a broken thing. But there was another man who didn't look away. He was standing near the front, dressed in a gaudy purple coat with a wide-brimmed hat. He had a thin, waxed mustache and eyes that darted around like hungry rats. He wasn't a rancher. He smelled of cheap cologne and popcorn. He was a showman, a collector of curiosities. He took a step forward, a gold tooth glinting in the sun. "I'll give you 10 silver for the giantess," he said, his voice slick as snake oil. "She'll look grand in a cage next to the bearded lady." The crowd murmured. This was entertainment, they understood. Her father's eyes lit up with greed. But before he could agree, Silas's throat went dry as desert sand. His boots scraped the clay as he pushed through the crowd. He didn't know why he was doing it. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe it was pure madness. The words were out of his mouth before he could catch them. "I'll take her." The showman spun around, his eyes narrowing. The laughter from the crowd died instantly, replaced by stunned silence. Silas ignored them all. He ignored the showman's venomous glare. He walked right up to the girl's father. "How much?" Silas asked, his voice low and steady. The drunk blinked, confused. He offered 10. 15, Silas said, pulling a worn leather pouch from his coat. He didn't have much. Just enough for that draft horse. But this was more important. The showman scoffed. 20, and she'll be famous. 25, Silas countered, his eyes locked on the girl. She had turned her head again, listening. The air grew thick with tension. It wasn't an auction for a horse anymore. It was a battle for a soul. The showman, a man named Bartholomew, licked his lips. He saw profit, a spectacle to be caged and gawked at. Silas saw. He didn't even know what he saw. He just knew he couldn't let that man have her. 30, Bartholomew hissed. Silas didn't hesitate. 50. It was every last coin he had, enough to buy 2 prize horses, enough to put him in a hard spot for the winter. The crowd gasped. The drunk's jaw dropped. Bartholomew stared, his face contorting in rage. For a moment, it looked like he might say more, but he just sneered, tipping his hat with a flourish. "She's all yours, rancher," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But when you find out what a burden you've bought, remember my offer." He gave the girl one last, possessive look, then melted back into the crowd. Silas ignored him. He counted the silver coins into the father's filthy, trembling hand. The man didn't even look at his daughter. He just shoved the rope at Silas with a sneer. "She's yours," he slurred. "Don't say I didn't warn you." As her father let go, the girl stumbled. Instinctively, she moved not away, but behind Silas, using his large frame as a shield. The rope went slack in his hand. Her thin shawl slipped, revealing shoulders that were strong, yet marked with old scars and fresh bruises, a roadmap of a life lived as less than human. Silas's jaw tightened. With a single, decisive tug, he untied the rough knot at her wrist and let the rope fall into the dust. He didn't say a word. He just stood there for a second, a silent guardian. He looked back once at the mocking, confused faces in the crowd. He saw Bartholomew at the edge of the yard, watching him, a cold promise in his eyes. Then Silas turned his back on them all. He walked toward his wagon, and the girl followed, her bare feet making almost no sound on the hard-packed earth. Each step was deliberate, careful. It was like she had spent her whole life waiting for this one moment, this one person to trust. By the time he reached the wagon, the sounds of the town had begun to fade. He lifted her gently onto the back, her towering frame surprisingly light. He covered her with a thick wool blanket, and for a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the wagon spokes. Then, so faintly he almost missed it, her fingers brushed against the sleeve of his coat. Just once. A whisper of a touch that said more than any words ever could. He didn't look back at her. He didn't need to. He just clicked the reins, and the wagon groaned forward, wheels grinding against the road. Behind him, the girl curled into a corner, her blindfolded face lifted toward a horizon she couldn't see. She didn't look back, and neither did he. Out there, beyond the reach of cruel eyes and mocking laughter, a man and a girl nobody wanted began the slow journey toward something even they couldn't yet name. But as the town disappeared behind them, Silas couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He couldn't shake the image of Bartholomew's cold eyes. He had won the bid, but he had a sinking feeling this was far from over. The wagon rolled on, a slow, creaking heartbeat against the vast, silent prairie. The sun beat down, turning the air into a shimmering haze. Silas kept his eyes on the road ahead, his hands firm on the leather reins, but his mind kept drifting back to the impossible weight of the girl in the back. She hadn't made a sound. Not a whimper, not a sigh. She just sat curled in the corner, her head held high, as if listening to a song only she could hear. The only time she moved was when a wheel hit a deep rut, jolting the wagon hard. Her fingers tightened on the wooden side panel just for a second. That small movement spoke volumes. She had felt the shift in balance, the lurch of the wagon, before the jolt even happened. It was a strange, unsettling awareness. As they crested a low hill, Silas glanced in the small, cracked mirror he kept angled to watch the road behind him. A dust cloud, small, but moving steadily, too steady for the wind. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. It was them, Bartholomew's men. He clicked the reins, urging the horses into a faster trot. The ranch was still miles away. Out here, there was nowhere to hide. The dust cloud grew larger, closer. He could make out 2 riders now, pushing their horses hard. The girl behind him stirred. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just shifted, turning her head as if to listen to the pounding hooves behind them. Her stillness was unnerving. It wasn't the stillness of fear, but of focus. "Hold on," Silas said, his voice a low growl. He snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched into a gallop, rattling and shaking over the uneven terrain. The riders were gaining. He could hear their shouts now, carried on the wind. They weren't trying to talk. They were closing in for a fight. Silas's rifle was under the seat, but getting to it while driving a runaway wagon was a fool's game. They were nearly on him. One rider pulled up alongside the wagon, a rough-looking man with a scar down his cheek. He reached for the horse's bridle. Suddenly the girl moved. She stood up in the lurching wagon, a towering, swaying figure. She reached out, not fumbling but with an impossible certainty, and her hand closed around a heavy sack of grain next to her. With a strength that shocked Silas, she swung the 100-pound sack over the side of the wagon, directly into the path of the rider's horse. The horse screamed and reared, throwing the man into the dust. He landed with a sickening thud. One down. The second rider cursed, pulling his horse back. He was smarter. He wasn't going to get that close. He drew a pistol, the metal glinting in the harsh sunlight. Silas saw it. There was no cover. The shot was coming. But the girl was already moving again. She pointed, her long arm extending with absolute conviction toward a dense thicket of mesquite trees off the road. It looked impenetrable, a wall of thorns. "There!" she said. It was the first sound he had ever heard her make. It wasn't a word so much as a raw, urgent breath. A command. Silas didn't question it. He pulled hard on the reins, wrenching the wagon off the road, crashing straight toward the thicket. Branches scraped and clawed at the sides of the wagon. It felt like driving through a wall of knives. The gunshot cracked behind them, the bullet whining past Silas's ear, burying itself in the wagon's side. They plunged into the darkness of the mesquite. It was a maze of twisted, thorny wood, but the girl was his guide. "Left," she breathed. "Now right." She was navigating by sound, by the feel of the air, by something Silas couldn't begin to understand. She was seeing without eyes. He followed her commands, twisting and turning the wagon through a path that shouldn't have existed. Behind them, he could hear the second rider crashing around, cursing in frustration, unable to follow. After what felt like an eternity, they broke through the other side of the thicket, back onto the open plains. The road was gone. The riders were gone. There was only the sound of the wind and the panting of the horses. Silas slowed the wagon to a stop, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned to look at the girl. She had sunk back down, her chest heaving. The blindfold was still in place, but her face was turned toward him. He was bleeding, a long gash on his arm from a thorn branch. He hadn't even felt it. He had bought her to save her. But out here, on this empty road, she had just saved him. The sinking feeling in his gut was back, but it was different now. It wasn't just fear of Bartholomew, it was awe, and a little bit of terror. This was no ordinary girl. He had bought himself a miracle, or a curse. He wasn't sure which. And as he looked at her, silent and towering in the back of his wagon, He realized he was in far deeper than he ever could have imagined. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was bleeding across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. The land opened up before them, a small, lonely house with a slanted roof, fences that leaned like tired old men, and a handful of cattle scattered across the prairie like dark stones. To Silas, this place had always been the definition of empty. It was a shell, a place to work and sleep and forget. But as he helped the girl down from the wagon, her hand light but firm on his wounded arm, the whole place seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. She stood taller than the porch beam, her borrowed shawl fluttering in the evening wind. She didn't look at the house. She tilted her face toward the sound of the cattle lowing in the distance, and for the first time since he'd laid eyes on her, Silas thought she looked almost at peace, almost home. Inside, the cabin was sparse and smelled of old wood smoke and bacon grease. It was a man's house, lonely. He stoked the embers in the hearth, bringing a small fire back to life. He gestured toward the water kettle hanging by the fire. Without a word, she moved. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. She walked straight to the kettle, her bare feet whispering on the floorboards. She found the ladle, the tin cups on the shelf, the small sack of herbs for tea, all as if she had lived here her whole life. As if she were guided not by sight, but by a memory older than the walls themselves. Silas watched her, silent, leaning against the doorframe. He had expected clumsiness, a slow and careful mapping of the room. But this was something else. It was like the house was speaking to her, telling her where things belonged. He thought about the ambush on the road, the way she'd known exactly what to do, the way she had navigated them through the thorny maze. It wasn't just good hearing, it was more. That night, after a silent meal of bread and stew, he put a piece of chalk on the rough-hewn table. He tapped the wood to get her attention. "Name," he said, his voice hoarse. She stood for a long moment, then crouched down, her towering frame folding with a strange grace. Her long, slender fingers, calloused from a life of hard labor, picked up the chalk. As steady as a surgeon, she wrote one word on the dark wood of the table in slanted, elegant letters. Emmeline. He read it aloud once, then again, letting the sound fill the empty corners of the room. Emmeline. It was a beautiful name, a name that didn't fit the broken girl he'd bought. Then he saw something else. Below her name, she had drawn a small, simple shape. A star. A 5-pointed star, drawn with a single unbroken line. A cold shiver traced its way down Silas's spine. It was the same star, the same brand his late wife, Sarah, used to burn into the handles of her tools. Her own personal mark. No one knew about that. He had packed all her things away in a trunk in the loft the day after she died. There was no way Emmeline could have known. He looked from the star on the table up to her blindfolded face. Her expression was unreadable. She turned without a sound and stepped out of the cabin toward the barn where he'd told her she could sleep in the clean hay of the loft. Silas stayed at the table for a long time, staring at the name and the star. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt haunted, not by the ghost of his wife, but by the presence of this impossible girl. He had brought a stranger to his home, but the chilling truth was beginning to dawn on him. Maybe, just maybe, she was the one who had come home, and he was the stranger. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of the sun. Emmeline woke before the birds, her bare feet making no sound on the dirt floor of the barn. Silas would find her already at work, moving with a quiet efficiency that was both incredible and deeply unsettling. He gave her simple tasks at first, mucking stalls, hauling water, but she always seemed to know what needed to be done before he even asked. One morning, he found her with the new draft horse, the one he'd meant to buy at the auction. The animal was mean-tempered, its legs swollen from an old injury. It had kicked down a stall door and refused to let anyone near it. But Emmeline was kneeling in the straw beside it. She had a wet cloth in her hand, and she was stroking its swollen leg, her breath a steady, calming rhythm. She moved slowly, patiently, whispering sounds too low for Silas to hear, and the horse, this beast that had fought every man on the ranch, stood as still as a stone statue. No kicking, no fighting, just a deep, shuddering trust. As Silas watched, she began to wrap the horse's leg in clean rags. After a few moments, she leaned her forehead against the animal's massive flank and closed her eyes. The horse let out a long, low sigh. Emmeline swayed, just for a second, as if dizzy. She pressed a hand to her own temple, a flicker of pain crossing her face before it was gone. It was like before, with the sack of grain, with his wound. It was as if she was taking the pain, the fear, the sickness into herself. He stood there, arms crossed, a strange protective feeling pulling at his chest. She was blind, yet she saw things no one else could. She was mute, yet she spoke a language the animals understood. Little by little, the silence between them was changing. It was no longer an empty void, but a space filled with unspoken questions. The first real storm came to test her, and to test him. It started as a warm, restless breeze at sundown. The sky was clear. Silas, thinking nothing of it, was stacking the last of the winter hay in the smaller, older shed at the far end of the property. Suddenly, she was there. She must have run the whole way from the house. Her hair was wild, blown loose from its braid, and her chest was heaving. She grabbed his sleeve, her grip surprisingly strong, and pulled him, tugging him away from the shed. "What is it?" he asked, startled. "Emmeline, what's wrong?" She couldn't answer. She just pointed a trembling finger straight up at the clear twilight sky. Her whole body was shaking. And then the world split open. A single, jagged crack of lightning tore through the sky from nowhere. It wasn't a flicker. It was a white-hot spear thrown by an angry god. It struck the ancient oak tree right behind the shed, the one that had stood for 100 years. The tree exploded. Fire and splinters rained down, and the shed where Silas had been standing just seconds before was engulfed in a roaring inferno. The concussion threw him to the ground, his ears ringing, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He staggered to his feet, staring at the blaze. Everything in that shed, tools, harnesses, a season's worth of hay, was gone. If he had been in there? He turned to look at her. She was on her knees, her hands pressed against the earth. She had known. She hadn't heard thunder or seen clouds. The air itself hadn't even changed. But she had felt it coming. She had felt the electricity building in the sky and had run to pull him from the path of destruction. That night, after they'd made sure the fire wouldn't spread, he sat across from her at the kitchen table. The only light came from the low glow of the hearth. He looked at his hands, then at her. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was living with something beyond his understanding. Something powerful. Something the world was not ready for. And as he looked at her sitting there, so quiet and so strange, he finally understood what Bartholomew the showman had seen in her. Not a curiosity, not a freak. He had seen power, and he had wanted to put it in a cage. The thought made Silas's blood run cold. He had saved her from the auction. He had saved her from the ambush. But how was he supposed to save her from the world when her very existence was a secret that could get them both killed? News of the lightning strike traveled fast. It was the kind of freak event people talked about for years. But the story that trickled into town was twisted. It wasn't that Silas Curian was lucky. It was that he was protected. By winter, the prairie had hardened under a thick blanket of frost, but the whispers in town hadn't cooled one bit. At the blacksmith's forge, men stopped hammering to lean close. muttering about the giant blind girl Silas had bought. At the general store, women pulled their children away when he came in for supplies, their eyes darting around like frightened birds. They said she stared too long at the cattle, and that the milk went sour. They said she could feel storms in her bones because she was consorting with the devil. They said she wasn't natural. It started small, a slow drip of fear into the cracks of the community. But fear spreads faster than fire on a dry plain. A ranch hand's prize goat gave birth too early to a stillborn kid. She touched it, the man swore in the saloon. The giantess, she put a curse on it. A farmer's young boy came down with a raging fever. The doctor said there was no hope. But Silas, hearing the news, sent Emmeline. She walked to the farm, gathered herbs from the creek bed that no one else knew grew there, and brewed a bitter tea. She sat with the boy all night, holding a cool cloth to his head. By morning the fever had broken. You would think the boy's mother would be grateful, but her gratitude was curdled by fear. How'd she know what herbs to get? She whispered to her neighbors. How'd she know he was sick at all? Mercy, when it comes from a source you don't understand, looks a lot like menace. The suspicion finally boiled over 3 nights later. The crunch of heavy boots on frozen snow woke Silas from a light sleep. He looked out the window. A circle of light was bobbing at his front gate. Torches, 8 of them. 8 men stood in the frigid air, their breath pluming white, their faces stiff with the kind of grim certainty that is always born from fear. The man at the front was Jebediah Withers, a hard-faced farmer whose own child had been taken by fever 5 years prior. His voice was thick with gravel and whiskey. "Curian!" he bellowed. "We want her gone!" Silas pulled on his boots and coat, grabbing the old shotgun he kept by the door. He stepped out onto the porch, the cold air hitting him like a slap. Emmeline was standing just inside the doorway, a dark, silent shadow behind him. "She's done nothing to you, Withers," Silas said, his voice level. "She's a witch," another man spat. "She calls down lightning. She sours milk. She deals in unnatural things. She saved your boy's life, Martin." Silas shot back at the farmer whose son had recovered from the fever. "Is that unnatural?" "That ain't the same as God's will," Withers snapped, stepping forward. His eyes were wild. "She handles beasts that throw every other man. She finds things no one can see. That ain't natural, Curian, and we won't have it in our town." A murmur of agreement rippled through the mob. One man shifted his grip on his torch, as if he was just itching for an excuse to light the thatch roof of the barn. Inside the cabin, Emmeline took a step back from the door, melting into the shadows. Silas thought she was hiding, but then he saw the glint of metal. She was holding the long, heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She wasn't scared. She was ready. Silas took a step off the porch, his boots sinking into the snow. He didn't raise the shotgun. He let it hang loose in his hand. His voice dropped low, as steady as a stone wall. "You call her a witch," he said, his eyes scanning each face in the torchlight. "Because you've forgotten what a blessing looks like. She calmed a horse that should have been put down. She saved a boy the doctor gave up on. She has done more good with her silence than any of you have done with all your loud, fearful talk." He took another step directly toward Withers. "You want to cast out a miracle because it doesn't look the way you expected it to. Go home, Jebediah. Go home before you do something you can't take back." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to die down. Withers opened his mouth, then closed it again. The certainty in his eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. The other men looked at each other, their righteous anger deflating into shame. One by one, they lowered their unlit torches. They turned, their steps heavy in the snow, and walked back through the gate. The ranch was quiet again, save for the sound of Silas's own breathing. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. He turned to go back inside. Withers was the last to leave. He stopped at the gate and looked back, his face a mask of cold fury. "This ain't over, Curian," he hissed into the darkness. "God will not be mocked. He will deliver his own judgment." The threat hung in the frozen air long after he was gone. Silas shut the door, a deep weariness settling into his bones. The immediate danger had passed, but he knew this was just the beginning. Withers hadn't been defeated. He'd been challenged. And a man like that, a man who cloaked his fear in faith, was the most dangerous kind of enemy there was. Snow piled up against the fences, and the wind howled across the plains like a hungry wolf. Life on the ranch slowed to the rhythm of winter. Each day was a simple measure of firewood stacked, cattle fed, and another night survived. In the forced quiet of the season, something shifted between Silas and Emmeline. The space between them, once filled with suspicion and questions, now held a fragile warmth. He started teaching her simple sign language. He'd trace the shape of the signs into her palm: water, fire, horse. She learned with an astonishing speed, her long fingers mimicking his clumsy movements with a natural grace. Sometimes she would take his hand to correct a shape, and her touch was gentle, patient. He found himself smiling, a rusty, unfamiliar feeling. At night, they sat by the hearth. She would be stitching scraps of cloth into a thick, warm cloak, her needle moving with a steady rhythm in the firelight. He would take out his old harmonica and play low, mournful tunes. He never knew if she could truly hear the music, or if she just felt the vibrations through the floorboards. But she would close her eyes and sway ever so slightly, as if the sound were a current and she was letting it pull her along. Those evenings became the kind of peace Silas had prayed for his whole life, without ever knowing it. But outside the warm circle of their firelight, the town's fear festered. Withers' threat had not been idle. The whispers didn't stop, they just grew quieter, more venomous. One morning, Silas went to the well and found the water tainted, smelling of oil and rot. Someone had poisoned it in the night. He spent the next week hauling water from the creek, his back aching, his mind churning with anger. A few days later, he found strange symbols carved into his fence posts, twisting ugly shapes that looked like snakes eating their own tails. It was a clear message: witchcraft. He knew it was Withers, or men loyal to him. It was a campaign of fear, meant to isolate them, to drive them out. Then came the morning he found one of his best heifers dead near the fence line. It wasn't a wolf. The animal's throat had been cut with a knife, its body arranged in a grotesque ritualistic pose. The story in town was that the witch had started making sacrifices. Silas knew the truth. It was Withers, escalating his war. He was no longer just trying to scare them. He was trying to ruin them. Silas was trapped. He had no proof. It was his word, the word of an outcast protecting a supposed witch, against the fear of an entire town. Every trip for supplies was a gauntlet of hateful glares and slammed doors. He was as much a prisoner on his own land as she was. The breaking point came on a bitter cold Sunday, the kind of day when the sky is the color of iron. A child went missing. A 7-year-old boy named Thomas, the grandson of Jebediah Withers. He'd been playing near the edge of the woods at dawn. All they found was one of his small boots, lying in the snow. Panic tore through the town like a hawk through a chicken coop. Mothers wailed. Men gathered with rifles and lanterns, shouting orders, their fear making them clumsy and loud. Dogs barked and ran in useless circles. They all knew who to blame. The whispers started immediately. The witch took him. A sacrifice. Revenge. Silas heard the commotion and grabbed his coat, ready to join the search party, if only to prove them wrong. But as he opened the door, Emmeline was standing in his way. She caught his arm, her grip firm. She shook her head. She knelt in the snow-dusted yard, placing her palms flat against the frozen ground. She closed her eyes, her face a mask of intense concentration. The search party was heading east, toward the woods where the boot was found. But Emmeline, after a long, still moment, rose to her feet. She walked west, away from the woods, toward the rocky, treacherous hills. She moved with a strange certainty, occasionally stooping to trace a mark in the snow that no one else could see. A bent twig, a disturbed pebble, a faint depression the wind had not yet erased. She was tracking him. But it was more than tracking. It was as if she were connected to him by an invisible thread. She stopped at the edge of the property and pointed silently, her arm as steady as a compass needle. She wasn't pointing at the hills, she was pointing at something much worse. The old, abandoned silver mine, a place of collapsed tunnels and deep, flooded shafts. A place children were forbidden from ever going near. A place no one in their right mind would think to search. Silas looked from her pointing finger to the dark, gaping maw of the mine entrance in the distance. A cold dread washed over him. The boy wasn't just lost, and Emmeline didn't just know where he was, she knew who he was with. "Stay here," Silas signed to her, his movements sharp with urgency. "Lock the door." She shook her head, her expression resolute. She picked up a heavy lantern and held it out, then pointed to the mine, and then to herself and to him. "We go together." Silas didn't have time to argue. He grabbed his shotgun and they ran, their boots crunching in the snow, leaving the frantic, misguided search party far behind. The whole town was looking in the wrong place. They were following logic. Emmeline was following the truth. As they neared the dark opening of the mine, a faint flickering light danced from within, and they heard a voice, a slick, oily voice Silas recognized with a jolt of pure ice in his veins. "He'll be our key, my dear giantess. Your friend the rancher will give you up to get the boy back, and then you and I have a contract to fulfill." It was Bartholomew, the showman. He had never left. He'd been hiding, waiting, poisoning the town's mind with the help of a bitter old man. And now he was making his move. Silas and Emmeline exchanged a look. The trap hadn't been set for the boy. It had been set for her, and they had just walked right into it. They crept into the mouth of the cave, the air growing cold and damp. The tunnel opened into a small cavern lit by a single lantern. In the center of the cavern stood Bartholomew, a wide, triumphant grin on his face. He held a large knife, and in front of him, tied to a wooden support beam, was little Thomas Withers, shivering with cold and fear. Standing next to Bartholomew, looking pale and horrified, was the boy's own grandfather, Jebediah Withers. I never wanted this," Withers stammered, looking at his terrified grandson. "Bartholomew, you promised no one would get hurt. We were just going to scare Curion." "Plans change, old man," Bartholomew sneered, pressing the flat of the blade against the boy's cheek. "I got tired of waiting for your pathetic scare tactics to work. It's time for a more direct approach." He looked up and saw Silas and Emmeline standing in the shadows of the tunnel entrance. His grin widened. "Ah, the main attractions have arrived. Curion, you have something that belongs to me. Give me the giantess and the boy lives. It's a simple trade." Silas raised the shotgun, his knuckles white. "Let the boy go, Bartholomew." "I don't think so," the showman said, his voice dangerously calm. He moved the knife, the sharp edge now resting against the boy's throat. "Drop the gun, or the next show I put on will be a very, very short one." Withers let out a choked sob. "Don't hurt him, please, I'll do anything." Silas's mind raced. He was too far away to rush him. A single shot could miss and hit the boy. They were trapped. Then Emmeline moved. She stepped out of the shadows and into the lantern light, her immense height seeming to fill the entire cavern. She held her hands up, palms open, a gesture of surrender. Bartholomew's eyes gleamed with victory. "A wise choice, my dear. Come here, slowly." Emmeline took a step forward, then another. She walked with that same deliberate, silent grace, but her face, usually so calm, was a mask of cold fury. Silas knew she wasn't surrendering. She was positioning herself. She was doing something. When she was just 10 feet from Bartholomew, she stopped. She tilted her head as if listening. And then she opened her mouth. It wasn't a word that came out. It was a sound. A low, resonant hum that started deep in her chest. It grew in volume, a single, pure note that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The note shifted, rising in pitch until it was a piercing, disorienting shriek that echoed off the cavern walls, drilling into their skulls. It wasn't human. It was the sound of the earth itself screaming. Bartholomew cried out, clapping his hands over his ears, his face contorted in agony. The knife clattered to the stone floor. The boy, Thomas, stared, his eyes wide with awe. Even Withers was on his knees, stunned by the impossible sound. It was the opening Silas needed. He didn't fire the gun. He charged, a roar of pure rage tearing from his throat. He slammed into Bartholomew like a freight train, driving him back, away from the boy. They crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. The showman was wiry and quick, squirming out from under Silas and scrambling for the knife. But before he could reach it, a shadow fell over him. Emmeline. The sound had stopped. She stood over Bartholomew, her face terrible and beautiful in the flickering light. She didn't touch him. She just looked down at him. And in that moment, she was not a blind, broken girl. She was a vengeful angel. She was judgment. Bartholomew froze, his hand hovering over the knife. He looked up at her, and for the first time, Silas saw true fear in the man's eyes. He scrambled backward, crab-walking away, and fled into the darkness of the deeper tunnels, like the rat he was. Silas didn't go after him. He ran to the boy, quickly cutting the ropes. Thomas threw his arms around Silas's leg, sobbing. Jebediah Withers staggered to his feet, his face streaked with tears of shame and relief. He looked from his rescued grandson to Silas, and then to the tall, silent woman who had saved them all. He started, his voice cracking. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Can you ever forgive an old fool? Silas looked at Emmeline. She walked over to the boy and knelt, her huge frame folding down until she was at his level. She gently brushed the hair from his tear-stained face. She looked at Withers, and then she nodded. Just once. At that moment, the men from the town, having finally realized the search party was heading in the wrong direction, arrived at the mouth of the mine. They peered into the cavern, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock at the scene before them. They had come expecting to find a monster. Instead, they found a miracle. The fear that had poisoned the town didn't just break that day, it shattered. When they returned from the mine, the story spread like wildfire. The tale of Jebediah Withers' foolish pride, the evil of the showman Bartholomew, and the impossible courage of the silent, giant girl. The townspeople, who had been so quick to cast stones, were now humbled by a shame so deep it was a physical ache. They came to the ranch, one by one. The farmer whose son she had healed brought a basket of fresh eggs. The blacksmith whose forge she had passed every day with her head held high offered to shoe Silas's horses for free for a year. The women who had whispered curses now whispered her name with a reverence usually reserved for saints. They didn't just respect her now. They protected her. She had become one of them, theirs. Years rolled by like seasons. The ranch thrived. The fences, once leaning and tired, now stood straight and strong. Silas built a long, sturdy bench beneath the old cottonwood tree at the top of the hill, and it became their spot. Most evenings, they would sit there, shoulder to shoulder, and watch the prairie burn gold and orange as the sun went down. She would take his hand, her fingers laced through his, and he would pour them both steaming cups of tea. In the shared silence, they found a home. One twilight, after nearly a decade of these quiet evenings, A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. A single rider on a sway-backed horse. As he got closer, a cold, familiar dread settled in Silas's stomach. It was her father. Older, filthier, but with the same greedy light in his eyes. He had heard the stories, of course. Stories of the miracle woman of Curian Ranch. He'd come back not for his daughter, but for the commodity she had become. He dismounted at their gate, his voice a drunken rasp. "I've come for what's mine. They say she's worth a fortune now. I'll take my cut." Silas stood up, his hand resting on the axe he'd been using to chop wood. "You sold her. She's not yours." "Blood is blood," the man snarled, taking a step forward. "She's my kin. You have no claim on her." But before Silas could answer, Emmeline stood up. She moved in front of him, a towering protective shield. She turned her face, still blindfolded after all these years, toward the man who had sold her for 50 pieces of silver. And then she spoke. Her voice was rough from years of disuse, like stones grinding together, but it was clear, and it was strong. "You are not my blood," she said, each word a hammer blow. "You were a hired hand on my father's farm. You let the wagon crash, you let them die, and you stole me, a blind, silent child, because you thought no one would ever know." The man staggered back, as if she had physically struck him. His face went white with shock and fear. "It was an accident," he stammered. "No," Emmeline said, her voice ringing with a terrible certainty. "It was greed, and it ends now. You have no power here." As she spoke, figures began to appear from the town. The blacksmith, the farmers, Withers himself. They had seen the rider coming and had come to stand with their own. They formed a silent, grim wall behind Silas and Emmeline. Her father looked at the hard, unforgiving faces. He looked at the giantess he had wronged, and he saw no profit here, only judgment. He scrambled back onto his horse and galloped away, a pathetic coward swallowed by the dust. He was never seen in those parts again. A profound silence settled over the ranch. The townspeople nodded to Silas, a gesture of solidarity, and quietly departed, leaving them in peace. Emmeline turned to Silas. The setting sun caught the edges of her hair, creating a fiery halo. Her lips, which had just spoken words of judgment and truth, softened. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his weathered cheek. "I do not need sound," she whispered, her voice now as soft as the evening breeze. "Only you." Silas felt a burning in his eyes. He took her hand and held it tight, his own voice breaking as he answered. "I hear you, Emmeline," he said. "I always have." The wind carried their words, their shared silence, like a hymn across the wide, open horizon. From that day on, when travelers passed through and asked about the tall, quiet woman at the Curian Ranch, the story they were told was simple. She was the one who saw with her heart, spoke with her soul, and healed a whole town without ever needing to raise her voice. The giant girl who was once sold as worthless had become their greatest treasure. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one.